Well, we saw that while talking about anti-national colonial nationalism, uh, Partha Chatterjee talks about two domains in the social institutional practices, the material and the spiritual. And he acknowledges the material superiority in terms of material development of the West, whereas we have our own distinctness we can say, of spiritual culture. And then he talks about the implications. Now, what are these implications? Implications, as I said earlier, is a kind of conclusion that can be drawn from something. For example, based on the discussion, we come to certain conclusions. Now, what are the implications of this claim? Means he talks about what we call the material domain and spiritual domain, and then he accepts the superiority of the West in terms of material development, material domain, but he says that in terms of spiritual culture, we have our own distinctiveness, and this has several implications. He first refers to nationalism. Nationalism declares the domain of the spiritual, its sovereign territory. In terms of anti colonial nationalism, we are talking nationalism in India and nationalism in other Asian and African countries. Spiritual domain has its own sovereign territory, it has its own place, and it refuses to allow the colonial power to intervene in that domain. So this has to be underlined. Although we looked at West, we tried to imitate the West for its material achievements, for its material accomplishments. The spiritual domain is something which is to be underlined, which is to be understood in terms of its distinctiveness. And this domain refuses to allow the colonial power, British, French, or whatever, to intervene in that domain. If I may return to the Indian example, he says, he said, return to the Indian example again, once again. The period of social reform was actually made up of two distinct phases. Okay, and I'm sure that you are also familiar with the period of social reforms in India. Okay, so this particular period of social reform in India has two phases. What are these two phases? The first phase, okay, can be called, he states here, just a minute, I shall talk about that. In the earlier phase, or the first phase, Indian reformers looked at to the colonial authorities to bring about, by state action, the reform of traditional institutions and customs. You must be knowing that Rajaram Mohan Roy, Mahatma Phule, wrote letters to the British viceroys for bringing revolution in the traditional society. So Indian reformers like Rajaram Mohan Roy or what I said, Mahatma Phule, wrote letters to the British government for the reforms. They looked at West for the Enlightenment. Okay, you must be studying these things in your paper one, Indian writing in English. That's the background. So there were many religious reforms. So that can be called the period of religious reforms. Okay. So the reformers like Rajaram Mohan Rai, Keshav Chandra Sen, Rabindranath Tagore's father, Devendranath Tagore, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, or Ramakrishna Paramhans. Might be knowing. Swami Vivekananda, all these figures, Dayanand Saraswati of Arya Samaj, okay, Jyotiba Phule, as I said, in Western India, then the Prarthana Samaj, Bapu Govind Ranade, Madhav Govind Ranade, Mahadev, sorry. And then you talk about many, Annie Besant is there. Among Muslims, Sayyid Ahmad Khan was the one who tried to bring changes in the Muslim society. So these are the things that we need to understand. Even women reformers as like Pandita Ramabai, Sarojini Naidu, etc., were the contributors to this particular period. So during the first phase, Indian reformers looked to the colonial authorities, as I mentioned earlier. They thought that the British government can bring this change. But in the latter phase, although the need for change was not disputed, of course, there was a need for change that was agreed unanimously, but there was a change in the approach. There was strong resistance to allowing the colonial state to intervene. In the earlier phase, the colonial state was requested to intervene. But in the second phase, there was a resistance to this intervention, especially in the matters affecting national culture. Therefore, according to Partha Chatterjee, the second phase was the period of nationalism. It was already the period of nationalism. So, this has to be noted down. So, during this phase, the colonial state, the British government, for example, in India, is kept out of the inner domain of national culture, that is spiritual culture. This is the inner domain, not the outside domain. Material development, a material domain was the outside domain, something which we took from the European, the Western countries. But it is not as though this so called spiritual domain is left unchanged. Although there was a resistance for the colonial power to intervene, but this domain too was changed. So, in this domain, nationalism launches its most powerful, creative, and historically significant project, he says. What is that? What happened here? So, nationalism was to fashion a modern national culture, and it was not Western one. Okay, this modern national culture that was launched during this period was not Western one. Therefore, he says if the nation is an imagined community, he refers to Anderson once again, then this is where it is brought into being. Okay, this is in the spiritual domain, this particular idea was brought into existence. And therefore, in this domain, it's true and essential domain. Means in terms of this, the nation is already sovereign. Means although the state is in the hands of the colonial power, the government state refers to government. The nation was not in the control of the colonial power. As a nation, means that was a spiritual domain, and we never allowed Britishers to take control of our souls. Okay, they of course controlled us physically, not in terms of spirit, we can say. Therefore, he says, here we stood as imagined community. Our togetherness was felt, was imagined. And the dynamics of this historical, which, sorry, the historical nationalism has once more appeared on the agenda of world affairs. I'm sorry, I'm going somewhere wrong. I'm very sorry for that. Yeah. So, as a project, it completely misses in conventional histories. That's what it says. The history does not take note of this. The dynamics. Dynamics means the power of this particular movement is not taken into consideration by historians. Here, the story of nationalism begins with the contest for political power. So, our resistance begins from the spiritual domain, and then we start fighting for the political power, means the government and all. Initially, we understood that we are different. We the people of India are different, and that sense of awakening took place. We awakened ourselves from the deep slumber, from the sleep. And in this part, Partha Chatterjee, highlights several areas of the spiritual domain. We shall be talking about these domains one by one in the next part of our lecture.